The morning was warm and quiet, the kind of southern stillness that made the world feel pause like God himself was holding his breath. Caleb Warwick rode along the narrow dirt path that curled through his grandfather's old property, new boots in the stirrups, rifle strapped across his back, sweat already gathering beneath his shirt despite the early hour. The land was untamed, dry in patches and overgrown in others, but the air smelled of pine and dust, and Caleb, after weeks of restless nights in town, finally felt something close to peace, until his horse stopped dead. One minute they were trotting smoothly down the trail, the next his mare Juniper froze like she'd hit a wall. No stumble, no misstep, just a hard stop, neck stiff, ears, flattened muscles, locked beneath her saddle like stone. Caleb furrowed his brow, pulled gently at the reins. Nothing. He gave a soft click with his tongue and nudged her sides with his boots. Still nothing. She didn't buck, didn't rear, just stood there staring ahead, frozen. "What the hell's gotten into you, girl?" he muttered. Juniper's nostrils flared. Her eyes darted toward the right side of the path, to the base of a sprawling oak tree that stood alone on a low rise. It was the kind of tree that drew the eye, thick-trunked and ancient, with limbs like twisted arms reaching toward the sky. The grass around it was oddly flat, patchy, a ring of bare earth at its roots, as if nothing dared grow there. Caleb had noticed it before, but thought nothing of it, just another relic on a forgotten piece of land. But now Juniper refused to take a step closer. Caleb dismounted, boots crunching against dry leaves and brittle grass. He walked around to the front of his horse, took her face gently between his hands and looked into her eyes. "You all right, Junie?" She snorted, then took a single step backward. Not from him, from the tree. He turned to look at it again. The bark was peeling near the base, and a length of thick rope lay coiled in the weeds nearby, half-buried frayed at the end. Caleb stepped toward it, out of curiosity, bent down and picked it up. It had clearly been there for years. The fibers were dry, cracking under the weight of time. A noose. He stood up slowly, the rope still in his hand. A strange breeze swept past him, cool and sudden, almost sharp, as if it had come from the ground itself. Caleb frowned and looked around. Nothing moved, no birds chirped, no cicadas, just silence. He didn't believe in ghost stories, not really. But something in his stomach tightened, and for the first time since he'd arrived at the farm, Caleb felt like a stranger on his own land. "Come on, girl," he said again, walking back toward Juniper. But Juniper wasn't moving. She was trembling now, her legs stiff and breath shallow, like a storm was building inside her, and she couldn't run from it. Caleb tried pulling gently at her reins again, but she yanked her head away, almost knocked him off balance. "All right," he whispered, letting go. "All right." He looked at the tree one more time, then up at the sky. A cloud had drifted in, casting the whole area in an unnatural grayness, though the sun was still rising. The air smelled different now, not just pine and dust, but damp earth and old smoke. He left the rope lying where he'd found it and led Juniper around the other way, taking a longer path back toward the main house. But even as they moved away, she kept glancing back, and so did he. Later that night, Caleb couldn't sleep. Not because of the heat, not because of the bugs, but because of that feeling like something had been watching him from that tree, like something had been waiting. He didn't say a word to anyone in town the next morning. What would he even say? He just rode again. And when he reached that same stretch of trail, Juniper stopped cold. Again, exact same spot. But this time, Caleb didn't try to force her. This time, he looked at the tree not as a landmark, but as a question, and he realized something here had been left unfinished. Caleb didn't ride the rest of that morning. He tied Juniper in the shade and walked the fields on foot, letting the silence stretch around him like a worn blanket. The wind moved only enough to rustle the grass, and even then it seemed careful not to disturb anything more than it had to. There was something heavy about this land. He could feel it in the bones of the house, in the hollow stillness of the barn, in the way even the birds seemed to sing softer. He told himself it was just history. Old land had old memories. Nothing unusual about that. But later, when he walked past the upstairs hallway mirror, something stopped him cold. It was just a glance, a flicker of movement in the glass, but it felt like being doused in ice water. Caleb stepped back, heart thudding, and stared hard at his own reflection. Nothing wrong, just his face, just the hall behind him, just the soft creak of wood underfoot. He waited. 1 second, 2, 3. Nothing. Shaking his head, he laughed under his breath. "Get a grip," he muttered. "You're not 12. But that night it happened again. He'd fallen asleep on the old couch in the front room, bourbon glass half full beside him. A noise woke him, a soft rhythmic, like someone breathing through tears. He sat up fast, the glass tipping and spilling onto the floor. The sound stopped. He listened hard. Silence. And then he heard it again. Not from outside, from the hall mirror. He crept toward the hallway and turned on the light. The mirror stood still, clean and quiet, but his skin prickled with the kind of certainty you can't argue with. He hadn't imagined it. Something had been there. Not a shape, not a shadow. Something. The next morning he went to town. He didn't plan to talk to anyone about it. He just needed distance, a change of air. But when he stopped at the general store for supplies, he found himself lingering at the old newspaper rack near the back. The editions were decades old, yellow and crinkled at the corners, but there was a charm to them. Local stories, births, deaths, sales of land, nothing out of the ordinary, until he found a piece dated August 24th, 1876. A headline no bigger than a matchbox: "Young boy hanged for theft at Warwick Estate." Caleb blinked. Read it again. Then again. The article was short, barely a paragraph. Said a 14-year-old colored boy named Micah was caught stealing bread and met swift justice under the authority of landowner J. Warwick. No trial, no family. Just a single line at the end: "Burial on property near Oak Tree." Caleb didn't move for a long time. His fingers tightened on the paper. His stomach turned. That name, Warwick. His name. His grandfather's. It wasn't just any land. It was this land. And that tree. He folded the page, gently placed it in his jacket pocket, and left without a word. Back at the house, the sky had turned strange. Not stormy, but yellowed like the air before lightning. He climbed the stairs, walked the hall toward the mirror heart, hammering harder with every step. He stopped in front of it, waited. Nothing happened. But on the floor below, the mirror half hidden under the wooden molding, was a loose board. He knelt down, pried it free, and reached inside the dark gap. His fingers touched something dry, fragile, a piece of paper, folded carefully, tucked away with purpose. He opened it slowly. The ink was faint, smeared by time, but there were words. Scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting: "I did not steal the bread. I was hungry. Please, if someone finds this, don't forget my name." At the bottom, Micah. Caleb sat back hard against the wall, the paper trembling in his hands. The air around him felt thick, like the walls were holding their breath. He didn't know how long he sat there. But when he finally looked up, he wasn't afraid. He was angry. Caleb sat there for what felt like an hour, the letter still open across his knees. The name Micah etched so firmly in his mind it might as well have been branded. The house around him creaked and settled with the weight of years, but he no longer felt watched. He felt judged, not by a ghost or spirit, but by the silence itself. By the generations who'd lived here and never once spoken that boy's name. By the rope he'd found beneath the tree, the mirror that refused to lie, the horse who saw what no man wanted to see. He folded the note with care and slid it into his breast pocket, then stood slowly, every movement deliberate now, as if he feared disturbing the air too quickly might erase the clarity that had finally settled in his chest. For the first time since arriving, Caleb understood the land he stood on was not truly his. It had memory, it had voice, and he was merely the next man to answer to it. Downstairs, the morning light had turned pale and heavy, the way it sometimes did before a summer storm. He made a pot of coffee and let it sit untouched on the stove, his hands restless as his thoughts circled tighter and tighter around the same question. What else had been hidden here? And why had no one ever told him? He returned to the barn this time, not for his horse, but for the records his grandfather had kept in a rusted metal cabinet near the far stall. Caleb had skimmed them before when he first arrived: receipts, land deeds, tax forms, but now he opened each drawer with purpose, flipping through brittle manila folders until he found a ledger labeled Labor and Estate Management, 1875-1877. He laid it flat on the workbench, dust rising in soft clouds, and began to read. Page after page was filled with neat, cursive, almost too tidy to be human lists of names, wages, tools, purchased repairs, made defenses and roofs, Most of the entries were dull, unremarkable until he turned to August 1876. There squeezed between a weather entry and a receipt for tobacco was a line written in darker ink. Disciplinary action taken Remika resolved 823. No detail, no explanation. Just that resolved. His stomach twisted. Caleb turned the page hoping for more for anything, an acknowledgement, a name, a remorseful note in the margin. But the ink went dry after that. The handwriting changed in September and none of the entries after mentioned Micah again. He slammed the book shut. Out in the pasture, Juniper stood quietly under the same tree she'd always refused to pass. Caleb walked toward her boots' heavy fingers, brushing the letter in his pocket for reassurance. As he neared the tree, she stirred, pawed the earth, once then stood still again. He stopped just short of the tree's shadow. The bark had deep grooves running down one side, scars left by time and weather, or perhaps something far more violent. Up close, it wasn't just a tree, it was a witness, a grave marker without a name. And it stood with the patient certainty of something that had seen men lie, bury, forget. "I know what happened," Caleb said, voice low. "I know." The wind stirred the leaves above him, soft as breath. He looked down. The earth beneath the tree's roots was bare, but just beside the trunk, half sunken into the dirt, was the corner of something metal. He crouched, brushed the soil away, and unearthed an old rusted tin box. The clasp was broken, but inside, wrapped in a cloth, was a photograph, faded, cracked along the edges. A boy, thin, barefoot, with wide eyes and a quiet defiance in his posture. No name written on the back, but Caleb didn't need one. He stood there for a long time, the photograph in one hand, the letter in the other. Around him, the trees whispered in a language only time understood. He realized then that forgetting wasn't something that happened by accident. It was chosen, layered, repeated, inherited. And if forgetting could be chosen, so could remembrance. Caleb carried the photograph back to the house as if it were something fragile, as if the boy in it might shatter from sudden movement or careless hands. He didn't put it on a shelf or tuck it in a drawer. He cleared off the wooden mantel in the front room, swept away dust and the irrelevant remnants of whoever had last tried to decorate this hollow place, and set the photo upright against a candle stub. The image leaned slightly to one side. The boy's gaze angled just enough to avoid Caleb's, but there was something unshakably present about it now. The house felt altered, quieter somehow, but no longer cold. Not empty, just waiting. He sat in the room for a while without purpose. No paper to read, no music playing, no distraction in his hands. Just the fireless hearth and the sound of the house breathing in its floorboards and walls. Outside, Juniper stood near the fence, her silhouette still as a painting in the late afternoon light. The sun poured in through the high windows, painting golden squares on the dusty wooden floor, illuminating floating motes that shimmered like old ghosts. As evening crept closer, Caleb finally stood. He retrieved the photograph, folded the letter from Micah into his pocket again, and returned to the tree. This time he brought tools, a hand shovel, a hammer, and a piece of flat wood he had cut and sanded earlier that spring, not knowing why he'd kept it. Now he did. It wasn't a headstone, not in the proper sense, no granite, no marble, but it was honest. It would weather and it would gray, and maybe one day it would rot. But until then, it would stand. He carved the name slowly with a hunting knife, each stroke deliberate, sinking into the grain with the same care a man might give to prayer. Micah, 1862 to 1876. He was here, that was all. No lies, no sanctimony, no attempt to explain or atone. Just a name, a span of years, and the one truth Caleb could give. When he reached the oak, he paused for a long moment before stepping into the patch of earth that had resisted growth for decades. He knelt, brushed the ground clear with his hands, and dug a small hole just deep enough to anchor the wooden marker. As he hammered it into place, the sound echoed out across the field like a slow, steady heartbeat. Then he opened the cloth that had held the photograph and gently set the picture inside the hole before covering it back with dirt. Not to bury, just to return. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small bundle of wildflowers, sun-bleached and gathered from along the edge of the property. Nothing fancy, just the sort of thing a boy might have picked for his mother long ago if he'd had the chance. He laid them at the base of the marker and added one last thing, a modest loaf of bread wrapped in white cloth still warm from the oven in town. He didn't say a speech. He didn't bow his head. He simply stood there, one hand resting on the top of the marker, his jaw tight and his throat thick, and stared at the tree with the quiet recognition of someone who had finally learned the name of a ghost he'd been living beside all along. As he turned to leave, Juniper approached slowly from across the field. Caleb half expected her to stop short again, to pull back, to resist the invisible lines she'd drawn in the earth days before. But this time the mare stepped forward, calm, composed, her hooves quiet in the soft grass. She passed under the shadow of the oak without a single hesitation and stopped beside the marker, lowering her head briefly, as if in acknowledgement. Caleb swallowed hard. Something loosened in his chest, something old and unnamed. It wasn't forgiveness. He knew that now. Forgiveness belonged to the dead and the wounded and the countless others whose names he'd never know. But maybe this was peace. And peace, unlike history, was a thing a man could still choose. In the days that followed, Caleb found himself moving through the house like someone waking up in a place they'd lived all their life but had never truly seen. The shadows that used to unsettle him no longer felt foreign. The creaks in the floorboards had become familiar voices, part of the language of the house. Even the mirror in the upstairs hallway, where he once saw what couldn't be explained, now reflected only what was real, though perhaps a little more honestly than it had before. He started each morning by walking past the tree, not always stopping, not always lingering, but acknowledging it, like a nod to an old neighbor. Juniper followed easily now, never flinching, her gait relaxed as they crossed the once feared ground. She was different too, less anxious, more trusting, as though something had lifted from both of them. But it wasn't over. There were still loose ends, and Caleb had never been a man to leave things untied. The photograph had stirred something deeper than he expected. Not just guilt, not just curiosity, but a gnawing need to understand what kind of man his grandfather had truly been. He'd grown up hearing stories of old James Warwick, a war veteran, a respected landowner, a stern but fair man who always paid his debts and honored tradition. But now that portrait felt like a carefully framed myth, the kind of story men tell when they're afraid of telling the truth. He spent hours in the attic sorting through trunks filled with letters, ledgers, and brittle photographs of people no one had named. In one box, he found a bundle of correspondence wrapped in twine. Most of it was mundane orders for grain receipts for fencing, but near the bottom he found a letter written in his grandfather's own hand, never sent, dated just weeks before his death. To whomever finds this, there are things this land remembers, things I buried deeper than I should have. I told myself I did what was expected, that justice was swift, necessary. But that boy, he looked me in the eye and I knew. God help me, I knew. I hope someday someone will make it right. Not for me, for him. The signature was a shaky version of the confident scrawl Caleb had seen in the estate ledgers. James Warwick at the end of his life, writing not with pride, but with weight. And something else. Not quite shame, but something adjacent to it. Regret, maybe, or recognition. Caleb didn't know whether to feel pity or anger. Maybe both. Maybe neither. The man had lived and died without ever saying the boy's name out loud, yet here in ink was at least an admission, an opening, and it struck Caleb that perhaps some legacies aren't meant to be redeemed, but only recorded so they cannot be repeated. He kept the letter, not to display, not to prove anything, just to remember. Later that week, he invited the local school teacher, Miss Clara Mayfield, to visit the property. She was a sharp-eyed black woman in her 60s, born and raised in the same county, and one of the few people in town who spoke plainly. She stood beside the tree, read the simple inscription on Micah's marker, and said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. My grandfather knew a boy named Micah. Said he disappeared one day. Folks told him not to ask questions. She turned to Caleb. You're the first white man I've known to put up a name. Caleb didn't respond with thanks or apology. Instead, he asked her if she'd help him gather more names. Not just of Micah, but of others, boys and girls, men and women who'd worked and died on that land, never marked and never mourned. She agreed. Together over the weeks that followed, they began to piece together fragments, church records, whispered memories, faded birth ledgers. It wasn't much, but it was something. And Caleb began to write those names in a journal, not to be published, not to be praised, but to be preserved. There was a dignity in the act, a slowness, a reverence, because names mattered, and once spoken aloud, they couldn't be buried again. The journal grew thicker with each passing week. Caleb kept it on the kitchen table, never tucked away, always within reach. Its pages slowly filled not with paragraphs or explanations, but with names, first names mostly. Surnames had been lost or never recorded. Some were just nicknames passed down in whispers: Sweet Joe, Little Ruth, Mama Nellie. Each one was written with care, each letter like a quiet defiance against forgetting. Caleb didn't write eulogies or stories. He wasn't trying to explain who these people had been, because no document could ever hold that truth. He simply wrote them down one at a time, as if speaking them into permanence. And people began to come. Word spread slowly, at first passed from porches to barbershops to Sunday services. It wasn't a public announcement, not something he advertised, but the land had changed, and folks could feel it. A few curious souls wandered up the old drive, unsure what they were looking for, until they found themselves standing beneath the oak, reading the modest wooden marker, their eyes lingering on the simple words, "He was here." Some came in silence. Others wept. One elderly man removed his hat and whispered a name Caleb didn't recognize, then placed a stone at the base of the tree before walking away. It was never a crowd. The land didn't ask for spectacle. It asked for witness. And Caleb, he watched it all unfold with a quiet ache in his chest, the kind that made it hard to speak, but easy to listen. He didn't guide anyone. He didn't lead prayers or offer context. He just stood nearby when needed, and when not, he sat on the porch with the journal open, pen in hand, waiting for whoever might come to remember someone. One morning before sunrise, he returned to the tree alone. The air was thick with dew, and the field shimmered silver under the fading stars. He brought no tools, no offerings, just the journal and a folded piece of cloth. When he reached the marker, he knelt, brushing a few fallen leaves from its base, then unwrapped the cloth to reveal another loaf of bread, still warm, its crust golden, the scent rich and grounding. He placed it gently beside the flowers and stones left by others, then opened the journal to a blank page. With slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote Micah Warwick, 1862 to 1876. He was hungry. He was punished. He was not forgotten. And below it, he added a line that hadn't come to him until that very moment: "May the ground remember what men tried to erase." When he closed the book, he didn't stand right away. Instead, he leaned back against the base of the tree, feeling the rough bark press into his shoulders, and looked up through the branches. Morning light filtered through the leaves in soft gold streaks, the breeze catching them just enough to make them whisper. Not words, but something close, a rhythm, a hush, like breath. Juniper wandered into view a moment later, her steps light and unhurried. She stopped beside him and nuzzled his shoulder, and Caleb reached up to rest his hand on her neck without looking. They stayed that way for a long time. It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't closure. It wasn't meant to be. It was acknowledgement, and somehow that felt like more than enough. Later that day, Clara came by with a small bundle of old church records tucked under her arm. She found Caleb in the barn brushing down Juniper's coat, his shirt streaked with sweat and dust. Without a word, she handed him the bundle. Inside were a half-dozen pages, some nearly falling apart at the seams, but at the top of the first was a handwritten list of baptisms, names, dates, and one phrase that made his breath catch. Micah, child of no known kin, baptized with bread and river water. Caleb closed his eyes. Bread and river water. That was it, wasn't it? That was what the land had wanted, not revenge, not erasure, not a rewriting of history, but the return of memory, the act of naming, the offer of bread, and the clean, unclaimed grace of water. He placed the records inside the journal and set it back on the table, then stood for a long time at the window watching the tree. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a man standing over someone else's past. He felt like someone finally standing with it. The seasons turned slowly, almost imperceptibly, as they always did in that part of the South. Summer surrendered to fall in quiet degrees, the heat thinning just enough to breathe deeper, the leaves edging into rust-colored whispers, the air laced with the first hints of wood smoke and earth. Caleb watched it all from the porch journal, always close boots, muddy hands calloused but steady. He didn't track time by the calendar anymore, but by visits, by names, Each one arrived differently. Some were spoken aloud by strangers with tears in their eyes. Others came folded into old letters passed from hand to hand like sacred secrets. Some were etched into memory by grandchildren of men and women who had once labored under the sun on that very field, and though their stories had faded, their names hadn't. That was enough. By late October, there were nearly 50 names in the journal. Most had no last names. Most had no graves. But now they had pages. They had witnesses. And on a soft Sunday morning with the mist still clinging low to the ground, a woman arrived carrying a bouquet of wildflowers, and a boy no older than 10 clinging shyly to her side. Caleb met them at the edge of the field, nodding quietly, no questions asked. She handed him a slip of paper with a single name written in careful script, Lydia, and whispered, "She was my great-aunt." Nobody ever said where she was buried. Caleb opened the journal, found a clean page, and wrote Lydia with the same reverence he'd given the very first. The woman smiled. The boy looked up at the oak tree, his small hand reaching for his mother's fingers, and for a moment the three of them simply stood there. No need to speak, no need to explain. The tree said enough. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Caleb brought Juniper to the tree once more. She was older now, slower in her steps, but she still walked without fear. He tied her loosely to the fence and approached the marker again. Micah's still weathered but standing strong. Around it were the small offerings left by others, pebbles, flowers, scraps of cloth, even a little wooden toy carved by hand. Caleb knelt beside it and placed a fresh loaf of bread at the base, still warm from his oven. No speech, no ritual. Just an act, a memory made tangible. And as he stood brushing off his knees, he caught something in the corner of his eye. A figure not quite there but not imagined either stood just beyond the tree line. A boy, barefoot, small face, unreadable in the fading light. Caleb didn't move. He didn't speak. The boy raised a hand, not to wave, not to reach, but in a gesture that felt like acknowledgement. Then without sound or step, he was gone. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked down once more at the marker, then turned back toward the house, the light behind him long and soft. The land no longer felt heavy. It felt full. Not of sorrow, not of ghosts, but of memory. Of names spoken aloud. Of silence broken. Some said the past was a weight to be buried, a chain to be snapped. But Caleb had learned otherwise. The past wasn't something to escape. It was something to carry carefully, truthfully, without pride, but with purpose. So that others might walk freely. So that a boy named Micah would not be erased. So that a horse once frozen by fear could move forward. Some say the past is gone, buried beneath dust, time, and silence. But silence isn't absence. It's the echo of what was never said. The boy beneath the tree didn't ask for revenge. He asked to be remembered. And in the end, that's all any of us really want. Not justice, not redemption, just to know that once we were here, that once we mattered. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it, not for attention, but to keep the memory alive. Because names once spoken don't disappear. And some stories deserve to be remembered. Thank you for being here.